Some stories are too dark to tell, yet they linger, waiting for someone daring enough to listen. Tonight, we awaken the shadows of the past. Welcome to Quite History. The Great Airlift, the true story of the Berlin blockade, 1948-49. A historical non-fiction narrative. Prologue. The sky over Berlin. Berlin, July 1948. The city was dying, slowly, quietly, and in plain sight of the world. From above, the ruins still smoked 3 years after the war's end. Streets were shattered veins through which no life could flow. The old Reichstag stood like a hollowed skull, and from its crumbling steps you could see children digging through rubble for coal dust. The city had survived Hitler. It had survived the Red Army, but now it faced something colder: starvation. Every road, every rail line, every canal that led from the west into Berlin had been cut by Soviet troops. Stalin's blockade had slammed shut like a trap, sealing 2 million civilians inside. The message was clear: leave Berlin or watch it die. But in the western sectors of the city, American, British, and French, a handful of officers refused to surrender. Among them was an unassuming American general with wire-rimmed glasses and a bulldog jawline, General Lucius D. Clay. Standing in his command post on July 23, 1948, Clay looked down at a map of the divided city and whispered to an aide, "We stay in Berlin, come what may." The aide frowned. "Sir, we can't feed 2 million people by air." Clay stared at him for a long moment. Then he said the words that would change the course of the Cold War. "We'll see about that." That night, in the ruins of Tempelhof Airfield, an American pilot looked up at a starless sky and heard the distant hum of engines. One after another, C-47 Dakotas began to appear, gray, battered, and loaded with sacks of flour. It would become the largest humanitarian operation in history, and it began with a single plane. Chapter 1. The Ruins and the Divide. Berlin in 1945 was a carcass of a city. The war had left it hollow, streets reduced to gravel, bridges shattered, tram lines twisted into rust. Of its 4 million inhabitants, nearly half were homeless. When the Allies met at Potsdam to decide the fate of Germany, they split Berlin, like the rest of the country, into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. The division was meant to be temporary, a way to manage reconstruction. But within months, the cracks in the alliance began to show. In the Soviet sector, under Marshal Sokolovsky, rebuilding was quickly, but under a red banner. Stalin's vision was clear. Berlin would be his window into the West, but also his warning to it. In the American sector, General Lucius Clay, a pragmatic engineer-turned-administrator, watched the situation deteriorate with growing unease. The Soviets had begun a quiet campaign of pressure, cutting power to western zones, disrupting transport, and flooding the black market with inflated currency. Every step was designed to squeeze the Western Allies out of Berlin without firing a shot. By early 1948, the real battle had begun, not with guns, but with money. In Washington, the Americans and British introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, to stabilize the economy in their zones. The Soviets saw it as a direct threat. Within 48 hours, they retaliated by blocking all ground access to Berlin. No trains, no trucks, no barges. Berlin was an island, deep inside Soviet territory, 110 miles from the nearest Allied supply line. The numbers game. Feeding the western half of Berlin required 4,500 tons of food and coal every day. The city's power stations needed fuel. Hospitals needed medicine. Bakeries needed flour. General Clay's advisors told him bluntly, "It's impossible." The U.S. had a few transport planes left from the war, C-47s that could each carry about 3 tons of cargo. Even if they flew non-stop, day and night, it would never be enough. But Clay was not a man to yield to arithmetic. He had grown up in small-town Georgia, earned a reputation as a builder of roads and dams, and believed that logistics was destiny. On June 25, 1948, he sent a message to Washington. "We're going to stay in Berlin. The only way we can stay is by air. It's risky, but we'll make the attempt." Within hours, Operation Vittles, the code name for the Berlin Airlift, was born. First flights. The first C-47 lifted off from Wiesbaden Air Base on June 26, 1948. It carried 8,000 pounds of milk, flour, and medicine. As it approached Berlin, the pilot, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, looked down and saw the city stretched below like a skeleton, scorched, silent, but alive with flickering candles and basement windows. The landing strip at Tempelhof was cracked and cratered, but the plane came down safely. Children waved as it taxied in. Berliners called the aircraft Raisinenbomber, or raisin bombers, because of the tiny bundles of candy pilots sometimes dropped for them on parachutes made from handkerchiefs. That first day, 80 tons were delivered. By the end of the week, the number had doubled. It was still far from enough, but it was hope. A gamble against Stalin. From the Kremlin, Stalin watched in disbelief. He had expected the Western Allies to abandon Berlin within weeks. Instead, they were building an aerial lifeline, a corridor of defiance across his occupied zone. He could shoot the planes down, of course, but that would mean open war, and Stalin, for all his ruthlessness, knew the line between intimidation and catastrophe. So he waited, hoping the airlift would collapse under its own weight. In Washington, President Harry Truman faced his own gamble. The American public was weary of war, but Truman believed the defense of Berlin was a moral test, not just of strength, but of civilization itself. "We stay in Berlin, period," he told his cabinet. Tempelhof's miracle. As summer turned to autumn, the operation grew with breathtaking speed. The British joined in from their bases in Hamburg and Celle. The U.S. Air Force replaced the smaller C-47s with massive C-54 Skymasters, each capable of carrying 10 tons per flight. Pilots flew in every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, through fog, sleet, and Soviet searchlights. Air traffic controllers called it the greatest peacetime flying operation in history. By September, 1,500 flights a day were landing in Berlin. The people survived on powdered milk, dehydrated potatoes, and sheer determination. At night, when the city went dark due to Soviet power cuts, children would lie awake and listen to the steady thunder of engines overhead. They're angels in the sky. We gave them bread, but they gave us faith.
Chapter 2. The Bomber and the Winter of Steel. The Boy with the Handkerchief. Late August 1948. The air above Berlin was never silent now. Day and night, propellers hummed through the thick, smoky air, the sound of freedom, measured in revolutions per minute. At Tempelhof Airfield, children gathered at the fence, thin as fence posts themselves, cheeks hollow, eyes wide with wonder. They would wave when the planes came in, sometimes shouting English words they learned from the soldiers. One pilot, a young lieutenant from Utah named Gail Halvorsen, noticed them one afternoon after a long flight from Wiesbaden. The runway shimmered in the late summer heat. He saw the faces pressed against the wire, and something about them stopped him. He walked over, crouched down, and started talking in broken German. The children didn't ask for food. They didn't beg. They only asked one thing. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Halvorsen was struck by their discipline. He said, they were polite. Not a hand was out. They were proud. He reached into his pocket and found 2 sticks of Wrigley's gum. He tore them in half, 4 tiny pieces, and passed them through the fence. The children didn't fight over them. Instead, they broke them into smaller bits, passing them around so every kid could smell or taste it. Halvorsen stood there stunned. Then, almost without thinking, he said, "Tomorrow I'll drop more from the sky." One of the kids looked doubtful. "How will we know which plane is yours?" Halvorsen smiled. "I'll wiggle my wings." That night, back at Wiesbaden, he took his candy rations, chocolate bars and gum, and tied them to 3 little parachutes made from handkerchiefs. The next day, flying over Berlin, he dipped his C-54's wings twice and released the bundles just before landing. The parachutes floated down like snow, and below, the children cheered. Operation Little Vittles. Word spread fast. Within days, hundreds of Berlin children began to gather whenever a skymaster approached. They called him Uncle Wackelflugo, or Uncle Wigglewings. Halvorsen's commanding officer soon noticed the unusual pattern of children at Tempelhof. When confronted, Halvorsen braced for a reprimand. Dropping candy wasn't exactly in the mission plan. But instead of punishment, he got approval. General William Tunner, the logistical mastermind who had just taken over the airlift, understood the power of morale. He gave the project an official name, Operation Little Vittles. Soon, candy companies across America began donating sweets. School children in the U.S. sent handkerchiefs and letters. The American Confectioners Association pledged tons of chocolate, gum, and hard candy. Halvorsen and his fellow pilots tied the bundles by hand between missions, thousands of them, each with a tiny note from the children of America to the children of Berlin. From one pilot to a symbol. By September, Halvorsen's idea had gone viral in 1940s terms. Radio broadcasts carried his story. Newspapers dubbed him the Candy Bomber. Letters flooded in from across the United States. In Berlin, the effect was electric. Parents wept watching their children chase the parachutes. For many, it was the first time in years that laughter had filled the streets. It wasn't just candy, it was dignity falling from the sky. A reminder that someone, far away, unseen, cared whether they lived or died. Winter's approach. But as the story of Little Vittles spread warmth, the airlift itself faced its coldest test. October 1948 brought freezing rain and fog. Temperatures dropped below zero. Ice formed on wings and control cables. Engines seized mid-air. At Tempelhof, maintenance crews worked by lantern light, clearing runways of snow with hand shovels and fuel drums. The Soviets, watching from the perimeter, laughed and predicted the end. Coal was the blackboard of Berlin, and it was the hardest to deliver. A single apartment block could burn through a ton of it in a week. Every Skymaster that landed carried 10 tons, but it vanished almost as soon as it arrived. To keep up, Tunner reorganized the airlift into a precision machine. He called it the conveyor. Each plane had a 3-minute window to land, unload, and take off again. There were no second chances. Miss your slot, and you went back home with your cargo still aboard. The system was brutal, but it worked. By November, daily deliveries had climbed to 4,500 tons, matching the city's pre-blockade needs. Against every prediction, the airlift was winning. Christmas in the dark. Christmas 1948 came to Berlin wrapped in silence. Electricity was rationed to a few hours a day. Families decorated small trees with scraps of tinfoil and candles melted from soap fat. Then, on December 24th, the airlift hit a new record, 8,000 tons delivered in a single day. Pilots worked through snow squalls and fog, so thick they could barely see the wingtips. At night, the children of Berlin stood at their windows and watched the faint blinking lights of planes above the clouds. They whispered prayers to the candy angels. For many, those flights were the only proof that hope could fly. The Winter of Steel. January brought what Berliners would later call der Eiserner Winter, the winter of steel. Temperatures plunged to minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Coal froze solid inside the cargo bays. Engines cracked from the cold. At Tempelhof, one American crew spent 10 hours breaking ice from a runway with pickaxes, their gloves frozen stiff. Another plane crashed short of the field. Both pilots killed instantly. But the flights never stopped. Every time one went down, 2 more took off. Inside Berlin, families huddled in cellars, burning anything they could find. Furniture, books, old piano legs. But when they heard the thunder of engines overhead, they looked up and whispered, "Sie kommen wieder." They are coming again. A battle of wills. By February 1949, Stalin realized the blockade was failing. The airlift had become not just a logistical victory, but a moral one. Western unity was solidifying. NATO talks were underway. Even inside the Soviet zone, whispers of dissent spread. How could the West feed an entire city by air while we could not keep bread on our shelves? Stalin ordered new pressure, harassment flights, propaganda leaflets, and diplomatic threats. But Clay and Tunner ignored them. Every day, Berlin received its bread, milk, coal, and chocolate. And every night, the sky over Germany glowed with the ghostly outlines of hundreds of aircraft, their navigation lights tracing veins of light across the darkness. The world had never seen anything like it, and it was only the beginning. A letter and a promise. In March 1949, Lieutenant Halvorsen received a small package at his base. Inside was a handmade drawing of a parachute and a note written in careful childlike English. "Dear Uncle Wigglewings, thank you for the chocolate. I share with my brother. He say it is the best day in our life. Please fly again. We look up always. Your little friends in Berlin." He pinned it to his cockpit. He would keep it there for the rest of his life.
Chapter 3. The Sky Bridge. How Engineering and Willpower Defied an Empire. The Rhythm of the Air. By February 1949, the skies over Berlin had become the busiest airspace on Earth. At any given moment, as many as 1 aircraft per minute was flying the narrow 20-mile-wide corridors that linked West Germany to the trapped city. To stand on the edge of Tempelhof Field and look up was to see a sky crisscrossed with ghosts, silver-gray planes shimmering through fog and exhaust, stacked in perfect formation, one descending as another rose. To Berliners, this became the Himmelbrücke, the Sky Bridge. What had begun as desperation had evolved into a living system of precision and endurance, a feat of logistics so audacious that even the Soviets, watching through binoculars from their sector, marveled silently at the sheer coordination. And behind this miracle was one man, Major General William H. Tunner. General Tunner's War of Minutes. Tunner was not a man of poetry. He was a man of schedules. He had run the Hump, the treacherous aerial supply route over the Himalayas in World War II, where hundreds of pilots had died ferrying supplies to China. He knew how to run an airlift the way others ran factories. Now he would turn Berlin into his assembly line. When he arrived in late July 1948, he walked the Tempelhof ramp with a clipboard and stopwatch. He noted every delay: the truck that took too long to unload flour, the jeep blocking a taxiway, the pilot chatting with mechanics. Each wasted second was another child without coal. Tunner gathered his officers and said, "Gentlemen, this is not flying, this is production. We will build a factory in the sky." He outlawed hand signals. Ground crews would use radio and light systems for perfect timing. He banned pilots from talking to each other on approach. Everything would be automated and silent. Each C-54 would land, unload in 30 minutes or less, and take off again, without shutting down its engines. The first few days were chaos. Tempelhof looked like an industrial ballet of noise and confusion, but by September, Tunner's system was running smoother than a watch. One reporter who watched a shift change in Wiesbaden wrote, "You could set your clock by them. Every 3 minutes, another thunder rolls down from the clouds." Engineering the impossible. The British, operating from their bases in Hamburg and Celle, followed Tunner's example. They called their mission Operation Planefair. The two efforts worked in harmony. U.S. planes brought in food. British planes brought in coal. To handle the massive tonnage, new runways were built almost overnight. At Tegel, in the French sector, German workers, many of them women, constructed a 6,000-foot airstrip in less than 90 days, using little more than picks, shovels, and sheer will. They cleared forests, leveled ground, and removed an unexploded bomb left from the war, all while Soviet soldiers watched from beyond the wire. When the first C-54 landed there in November 1948, the crowd wept openly. One engineer said later, "It was the first time since 1945 that we built something instead of burying something." The Soviets blinked. Inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin was furious. The blockade, designed to starve the West out of Berlin, was turning into a propaganda disaster. Instead of abandoning the city, the Americans were feeding it and gaining global admiration in the process. Soviet intelligence reported that the airlift had become a symbol of Western perseverance. In Washington, it was solidifying the case for a new alliance, what would soon become NATO. But Stalin was trapped. To stop the airlift, he would have to shoot down Allied planes, an act of war he dared not commit. So instead, he turned to harassment. Soviet fighters buzzed the corridors, flying dangerously close to the transports. Radar jamming intensified. Radio frequencies were flooded with false signals and taunts. One British pilot recalled, "They would fly right at us, nose to nose, and veer off at the last second. You could see the red stars on their wings." But the Allied pilots never broke formation. Not one flight turned back. The heartbeat of the airlift. Every morning began the same way. Engines rumbled awake at bases like Wiesbaden, Rhein-Main, Celle, and Vosburg. Pilots gulped down black coffee, checked their charts, and stepped into the cold dawn, their breath steaming in the dim light. The C-54 Skymasters lined up like soldiers, their bellies packed with flour, potatoes, coal, or milk powder. Takeoff after takeoff, hour after hour, over the Rhine, over the Elbe, across the invisible line into Soviet airspace. They called it the milk run, but it was anything but gentle. The weather over Germany was treacherous, fog thick enough to erase the horizon, ice storms that turned windshields opaque, turbulence that rattled teeth. Pilots flew by instrument only, trusting their altimeters and timing to guide them through corridors so narrow that even a small deviation could bring a collision. One veteran later said, "You didn't look out the window, you looked at the clock and prayed the other guy was doing the same." By midwinter, Tunner's operation had become so efficient that flights were landing in Berlin every 63 seconds, 23 hours a day. The remaining hour was for maintenance, because the machines, unlike the men, could not run forever.
The women of the airlift. History often remembers the pilots, but thousands of others made the miracle possible, especially the women. In Wiesbaden, women worked the night shifts loading coal sacks into cargo bays until their hands bled. At Tempelhof, German widows ran the control towers and supply depots, keeping meticulous logs in freezing hangars. One of them, Hildegard Schaefer, later recalled, "We did not think about politics. We thought about potatoes, about keeping the children warm. When we heard the planes, we knew someone cared." The airlift had become more than logistics. It was a human chain linking nations, and each link mattered. The numbers begin to defy logic. By March 1949, the Allies were delivering over 8,000 tons per day. Coal, food, medicine, everything a city needed to live was falling from the sky. To accomplish that, the airlift consumed 5 million gallons of fuel each month, wore out hundreds of engines, and required thousands of men working around the clock. Every C-54 flew roughly 3 round trips a day. Pilots sometimes flew 16-hour shifts, catching naps in freezing bunks between missions. A statistician at Tunner's headquarters calculated that by spring, the aircraft of the airlift were flying the equivalent of the distance from Earth to the Moon every week. And still, the system held. Tension in Washington. In the White House, President Harry Truman faced relentless pressure to negotiate. Some advisors urged a deal with Stalin, lift the blockade in exchange for pulling Western troops out of Berlin. But Truman refused. He saw the airlift not only as a supply mission, but as a declaration of principle. The free world would not abandon its people behind the Iron Curtain. When asked by a reporter if the United States might back down, he said quietly, "We are staying, that is all." Life under the corridors. For Berliners, life under the endless roar of engines became its own strange rhythm. Children learned to sleep through the thunder. Teachers paused their lessons when the ceiling trembled from a passing plane. Mothers carried babies wrapped in blankets made from old uniforms. Fathers scavenged for scrap wood to patch holes in walls. And yet there was gratitude, an almost sacred reverence for the men in the sky. Many Berliners began writing the names of Allied pilots on handmade thank you notes, which they threw over the fence at Tempelhof. Some slipped them into coal sacks in hopes a crewman would find them back in Germany. One letter, found years later, read simply, "You bring us more than food. You bring us faith in humanity." A turning point. On April 16, 1949, the airlift reached its zenith. That day, Tunner ordered a test, a 24-hour maximum effort. Every available aircraft, every pilot, every crew was mobilized to see just how much could be done in a single day. By midnight, 1,398 flights had delivered 12,940 tons of supplies, a world record that stunned even Tunner himself. Coal fell like black snow from the bellies of planes. Flour and milk filled every storeroom. For the first time since the blockade began, Berlin's reserves actually grew instead of shrinking. The message to Moscow was unmistakable. You cannot starve a free city. Stalin's quiet defeat. In early May 1949, Stalin blinked. Without fanfare, Soviet trucks began removing barriers from roads and railways leading into Berlin. Radio Moscow announced that normal traffic would resume on May 12th. After 11 months, the blockade, the greatest gamble of the early Cold War, was over. When the first train from the west rumbled into Berlin that morning, crowds gathered on rooftops to cheer. The same children who had once begged for crumbs now waved flowers and sang. And above them, even though it was no longer necessary, the planes kept flying to make sure the victory held. The cost of the Sky Bridge. By the end of the Berlin Airlift, the Allies had flown 279,569 missions, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies. 31 American, 39 British and several German civilians had died in crashes or accidents. But 2 million people had survived. A city had been saved, not by bombs or armies, but by the relentless hum of engines and the courage of ordinary men and women who refused to let it die. They said it couldn't be done, Tunner would later write, but we built a bridge out of air, and across it walked the soul of a free world.
Chapter 4. The New World Born in the Ruins. The Morning After. May 12, 1949. Dawn broke over Berlin with a silence so profound that people stopped in the streets to listen to it. For nearly a year, the sky had never been still. Now, for the first time in 11 months, there was no thunder of engines, no endless procession of C-54s droning above the clouds. The Soviet blockade was officially lifted. The rail lines reopened, the highways unsealed. At 12:01 a.m., the first train from West Germany steamed into Berlin's Charlottenburg station, its whistle echoing through the ruins like a hymn. On its sides, Berliners had painted words in chalk. Wir danken euch. We thank you. Crowds lined the tracks, waving flowers, weeping openly. Some carried signs in English. You kept us alive. But even as the trains returned, the planes kept flying. The airlift continued until the autumn, to build up stockpiles in case Stalin changed his mind. When the last aircraft finally left Berlin on September 30th, 1949, its departure was met with a salute from every siren in the city, a chorus of triumph over tyranny. The price of defiance. The airlift had been a victory, but not without cost. In the 12 months of continuous operation, 101 lives were lost, pilots, crewmen, and ground workers. Their graves lay scattered across Germany, marked by simple white crosses. At the dedication ceremony for one of the first memorials, an American colonel said quietly, "They carried no guns, yet they fought a war, and they won it." The Berliners came to call them die Engel der Luft, the angels of the air. A divided city. The blockade's end did not heal Berlin, it hardened it. The Soviet Union, humiliated but unbroken, sealed its control over the eastern sector. In October 1949, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was proclaimed, its capital in East Berlin. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany was born, under Allied protection, its capital at Bonn. The line that had begun as a logistical arrangement now became an ideological border, one that would, in time, turn into concrete and barbed wire. The Berlin Airlift had saved the city, but it had also defined the divide that would dominate the world for the next 40 years. NATO and the dawn of the Cold War. The success of the airlift transformed the way the West saw itself. In Washington, Paris, London, and Ottawa, leaders realized that only unity could resist Soviet pressure. Out of that realization came the North Atlantic Treaty, signed on April 4, 1949, the birth of NATO. The treaty declared that an attack on one was an attack on all. For the first time, the United States bound its security to Europe's fate in peacetime. The bridge of air became a bridge of alliances. In the words of U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, the Berlin Airlift was more than a victory of supply. It was a victory of purpose, proof that free men could cooperate without conquest. The world had entered a new kind of war, one not fought with armies, but with ideals, economies, and symbols. And the first battle had been won by air. The candy bomber returns home. For Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, the end of the airlift was bittersweet. He had become a folk hero, the candy bomber of Berlin, Uncle Wiggly Wings to thousands of children who had chased his parachutes through the rubble. When he returned to the United States, he was greeted by crowds and reporters, even a parade in his hometown of Garland, Utah. Children waved miniature parachutes made from white handkerchiefs, just like the ones he'd used over Berlin. But Halvorsen never saw himself as a hero. He said in an interview years later, "I didn't drop candy to make a point. I dropped it because I saw kids who had nothing, and they still had hope. That kind of faith deserves something sweet." He would go on to serve for decades more, including a return to Germany years later as commander of Tempelhof Air Base, the same airfield where he had once wiggled his wings. Berliners never forgot him. In 1974, when he retired, hundreds gathered at Tempelhof to wave goodbye, holding signs that read, "Danke, Uncle Wiggly Wings." The miracle becomes memory. In the 1950s and 60s, Berlin rebuilt itself from ashes. Modern boulevards rose where ruins once stood, but the scars of division remained. The Soviets tightened their grip on the East, and in 1961, the Berlin Wall went up, slicing through streets, families, and memories. For many older Berliners, the wall's shadow was softened only by the memory of the airlift, proof that the world had once come for them when no one thought it would. In West Berlin schools, children learned about the Rosinenbomber, the raisin bombers. In their textbooks, photos showed C-54s flying low over rooftops, candy parachutes fluttering beneath them. One elderly woman, interviewed in 1989, the year the wall fell, said through tears, "When we heard the planes again that night, we knew the world had not forgotten us twice." A bridge that never fell. General Tunner's precision, General Clay's determination, Truman's resolve, and the courage of thousands of airmen and Berliners together built more than an airlift. They built a principle. When Stalin's blockade failed, it sent a message across continents. Coercion could be defeated by cooperation. And that message echoed through Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and beyond. In later decades, historians would call the airlift the first victory of the Cold War. But to those who lived it, it was simply the moment when hope proved heavier than hate, and yet, somehow, flew. The numbers that tell a story. By the time the last aircraft touched down in September 1949, the tally was staggering. 277,569 flights, 2.3 million tons of food, coal, and supplies, 11 months and 5 days of continuous operation, over 92 million miles flown, the equivalent of circling the Earth 3,500 times, 101 lives lost in service. Every statistic represented something human: a loaf of bread, a warm room, a child who didn't starve. Tempelhof today. Tempelhof Airfield stands quiet now. Its vast runways are a public park, its hangars home to exhibitions and memories. On summer days, Berliners ride bicycles along the tarmac where the Skymasters once roared. At the entrance stands a monument, 3 great curved pillars of concrete reaching skyward like wings. Each pillar represents one of the 3 air corridors from the west. At its base are the names of the fallen. The inscription reads, "They gave their lives for the freedom of Berlin." At sunset, the light catches on the stone in such a way that the shadows of the pillars stretch toward the east, as if still reaching across the old border. Epilogue: The Lesson of the Sky. History moves fast. Wars end, alliances shift, borders change. But the airlift remains something singular, a moment when humanity's best instincts triumphed over its worst fears. In a time of ruin, strangers flew through storms to feed a city they'd once bombed. In a time of walls, they built a bridge made of air. The lesson endures. When compassion takes flight, even an empire can be defied, and even the hungriest city can find its wings again. There was no Berlin Airlift medal when we began, one veteran pilot said in old age. The medal was the smile of a child with chocolate on his face. That was enough.
Of 1948 lived on. When the wall went up, Berliners whispered the old phrase, "They came once from the sky. Maybe they will come again." For America, the airlift spirit became doctrine. Presidents from Eisenhower to Kennedy invoked it as proof that the U.S. would never abandon those who fought for freedom. And for the Soviets, it was a reminder that brute force could contain a people, but never win their hearts. An unfinished bridge. By 1961, the Sky Bridge had become legend, but its shadow stretched long. The same runways that once landed food now launched reconnaissance planes. The same corridors that carried hope now buzzed with spies. Yet the airlift's lesson endured in the hearts of those who had lived through it. That freedom, once flown, cannot easily be grounded. And somewhere in Utah, an aging pilot named Gail Halvorsen received a letter from a grown woman in Berlin. It read simply, "I was the girl who caught your chocolate. I am free now. Thank you." He folded it carefully and smiled. The bridge still held. Chapter 6. The Wall and the Word, from Ich bin ein Berliner to the fall of 1989. The sound of concrete. In the summer of 1961, Berlin had fallen silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't relief or peace. It was the stillness of captivity. The wall that had begun as barbed wire quickly became concrete. Over the next months, soldiers built guard towers, rolled barbed coils thicker, dug anti-tank trenches. Searchlights turned night into gray daylight. On one side stood the German Democratic Republic, calling it an anti-fascist protection barrier. On the other side, the free world called it what it was, a prison wall built to keep a nation from escaping. Kennedy's Promise. June 26, 1963. A light summer wind rustled the flags atop Rathaus Schönenberg in West Berlin, as President John F. Kennedy stepped up to a podium. The crowd below, hundreds of thousands strong, pressed close, tears and banners everywhere. The speech had been drafted carefully, each word debated in Washington, but one line, handwritten in Kennedy's own scrawl, was his alone. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. The crowd erupted. Church bells rang. For a brief moment, the entire Western world breathed through one city. That sentence would echo across decades, carried by radio into East Berlin apartments where listeners turned the volume low, just enough to hear what freedom sounded like. Life in the shadow. Years passed. The wall grew taller.
Families divided by streets developed rituals of defiance, waving from upper floor windows, flashing lights at dusk, sending birthday messages through West radio stations. Some East Berliners tried to flee through tunnels, across rivers, even hidden in car trunks. Many succeeded, many did not.
The West built memorials for the fallen. Their names were read aloud each year near the Brandenburg Gate. Children in the West learned them in school. Peter Fechter, 18, shot while trying to climb the wall, 1962. In East Berlin, the regime taught silence. The Stasi, the State Security Service, expanded to one of the largest surveillance networks on Earth, one informer for every 60 citizens. Yet beneath the fear, small acts of courage persisted. A poem passed hand to hand. A banned Beatles record played quietly behind closed doors. The world changes around the wall. As the 1970s dawned, the superpowers found new ways to compete. In space, in Vietnam, in Olympic arenas. Berlin, frozen in geography, became a place of uneasy coexistence. Willy Brandt, West Germany's chancellor and a son of Berlin, began his policy of Ostpolitik, change through rapprochement. For the first time, West and East signed treaties acknowledging each other's existence. The wall remained, but the air softened. Families could visit for holidays. The subway lines, once cut, opened special border stations under strict watch. In 1971, the four occupying powers, the US, UK, France, and USSR, signed the Berlin Agreement, guaranteeing access to West Berlin. It was fragile, but it worked. Tempelhof's runways, once used by the airlift, now saw civilian jets, their engines a daily reminder that the city was still connected to the world. A cold peace and a hot competition. The 1980s brought both tension and transformation. Ronald Reagan entered the White House, vowing to renew American strength. In Moscow, an aging leadership struggled to maintain the illusion of control. In 1981, a young Polish shipyard worker named Lech Walesa founded Solidarity, the first independent trade union in the Eastern Bloc. When Soviet tanks threatened Poland, the world remembered June 1953 in Berlin and watched. Inside East Germany, quiet dissent grew. Churches opened their doors for peace prayers. Underground magazines circulated stories of corruption and hope. The Cold War was no longer a battle of armies. It was a battle of endurance and words. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. June 12, 1987. President Ronald Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate, his voice carrying over the concrete barrier and into the heart of East Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The line startled diplomats and thrilled Berliners. In East Berlin, people whispered the words to each other as if they were forbidden poetry. Reagan's challenge didn't bring the wall down immediately, but it marked a shift. By then, the Soviet Union was no longer the same empire that had built it.
The cracks begin.
Mikhail Gorbachev, rising to power in 1985, brought two words that would change history: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He loosened censorship, encouraged reform, and, crucially, signaled that Moscow would no longer send tanks to crush uprisings in its satellite states. In East Germany, however, Walter Ulbricht's successor, Erich Honecker, clung to the old doctrine. The wall will stand for 50, even 100 years, he boasted in 1986. But the world around him was shifting. Soviet troops were withdrawing from Afghanistan, communist governments were wobbling in Poland and Hungary, and millions of East Germans were watching Western television every night, seeing a different future play out before their eyes. The autumn of 1989. By the summer of 1989, the impossible was happening. Hungary opened its border with Austria, and East Germans vacationing there began walking across into freedom. Thousands left, then tens of thousands. Back in East Berlin, mass demonstrations filled the streets. Protesters carried candles instead of weapons, chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people." The government tried intimidation, then concessions, then confusion. By November, it was unraveling. The night the world changed. November 9th, 1989. At a chaotic press conference, a confused East German spokesman announced that citizens could now cross the border immediately. He meant soon, but the word spread faster than any order could contain it. Crowds surged toward the checkpoints. Guards, overwhelmed, uncertain, opened the gates. For the first time in 28 years, Berliners poured through, laughing, weeping, climbing atop the wall itself. Television cameras beamed the scene worldwide. Strangers hugging, champagne bottles opening, soldiers joining in. The sound of hammers on concrete filled the night. The wall, the symbol of division, fear, and 40 years of Cold War, was coming down, piece by piece, under the hands of ordinary people. The airlift's shadow returned. As the celebration spread, an older generation remembered another sound. The planes of 1948, engines roaring with food and hope. At Tempelhof, now silent, someone laid a wreath at the airlift memorial. The inscription, "They gave their lives for the freedom of Berlin," felt suddenly alive again. Berlin had been saved twice, once by air, once by courage. A new dawn. Within a year, Germany was reunited. NATO and the Warsaw Pact would dissolve their confrontation. The Soviet Union itself would soon cease to exist. But the story of Berlin, the bridge of air, the wall of stone, the words of defiance, remained the defining thread of the 20th century. Proof that the struggle for freedom can be delayed but never denied. Epilogue. The word that endured. At a ceremony in 1990, as the last fragments of the wall were carted away, a choir of children sang a song written for the day. Its final line echoed across the Brandenburg Gate. "Freedom does not fall from the sky. It is lifted by those who remember." The crowd stood in silence. Above them, cranes and new buildings rose where barbed wire once gleamed. And in a museum nearby, a small handkerchief parachute hung from the ceiling, white, simple, and sweet. The bridge that began with chocolate and courage had at last reached its far shore.
Chapter 7. The Lessons of Air and Stone. How Berlin Shapes the World Today, 1990 to present. The morning after the miracle. The day after Germany's reunification, October 4th, 1990, Berlin woke to a strange calm. Where border guards once shouted orders, children now rode bicycles. Where spotlights had swept for fugitives, cranes began lifting steel beams. Reunification was not a moment, it was a project. It would take decades to mend streets, economies, and identities separated for 40 years. Yet the spirit that rebuilt from ashes in 1949 returned. The city that had once survived by air now survived by faith in itself. Reconstructing a capital. Throughout the 1990s, Berlin became Europe's largest construction site. Cranes filled the skyline. Jackhammers replaced machine guns. The Reichstag, burned in 1933 and battered in 1945, was restored under the glass dome of architect Norman Foster, a transparent crown meant to symbolize government open to its people. By 1999, the German parliament moved from Bonn back to Berlin. The city reclaimed its role as the heart of a united nation and a reconciled Europe. In the same decade, the Airlift Memorial at Tempelhof was joined by a sister monument in Frankfurt and another in Celle. The three arches together formed a triangle visible from the air. The victory of air over fear, pilots called it. The new NATO. The Berlin story continued to guide American policy. In 1999, 50 years after the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO expanded eastward for the first time. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined, former adversaries now allied. Critics warned it would anger Russia. Supporters said the lesson of Berlin was simple: deterrence through solidarity. When the planes flew over Kosovo in 1999 to stop ethnic cleansing, officials in Washington cited the airlift as moral precedent. Feeding people instead of bombing them, one general said. Through the early 2000s, NATO's expansion continued. The echoes of Tempelhof's engines lingered in every new oath sworn to defend freedom's frontier. Berlin and the memory of walls. Even after reunification, Berlin refused to erase its scars. A 1-mile stretch of the wall was preserved as the East Side Gallery, painted with murals of peace and protest. Tourists walk where guards once patrolled, pausing before words in dozens of languages. No more walls between people. Berlin schools teach both miracles, the airlift and the fall, as twin pillars of identity. Every May, airlift veterans and their families gather beneath Tempelhof's arches. The ceremony ends with a single plane flying low over the city, a reminder that freedom once came with wings. From Cold War to cyber war. The 21st century brought new kinds of division. Firewalls replaced concrete. Misinformation replaced barbed wire. Yet the lessons of Berlin remained relevant. Information, like food, can sustain freedom or starve it. When the internet became a tool of influence and surveillance, German scholars drew parallels to the Stasi's archives, reminding the world that democracy depends on transparency and memory. Berlin, now home to startups and journalists, became Europe's symbol of digital resistance, where hackers, artists, and historians meet to keep information free. America and the spirit of the bridge. Every U.S. president since Truman has visited Berlin, each leaving words to mark their era. Kennedy, 1963, Ich bin ein Berliner. Reagan, 1987, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Clinton, 1994, freedom's work is never done. And Obama, 2013, our wall is not of stone, but of indifference, and we can bring it down. Each speech echoed the same conviction. that the bridge first built by the airlift still stands between nations and generations.
Tempelhof's second life. Tempelhof Airfield closed to aviation in 2008, but its story did not end. The vast runways became a park, the Tempelhofer Feld, open to all. Berliners picnic where C-54s once landed. Cyclists trace the old taxiways, and children fly kites where parachutes of candy once fell. In 2015, during Europe's refugee crisis, the old hangars became shelters again, this time for families from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The place that once fed a trapped city now gave haven to people fleeing new wars. Volunteers called it Airlift 2.0. The lessons. Historians often describe the 20th century as the century of total war and total recovery. Berlin embodies both halves. From the airlift came the lesson of logistics and compassion, that nations can wield technology for mercy as powerfully as for destruction. From the wall came the lesson of endurance, that no barrier lasts forever against the human will to connect. Together, they formed the modern creed of Berliners, written on a plaque near the Brandenburg Gate. First, we were fed by air. Then, we were freed by word. Now, we are bound by memory. The bridge still holds. In 2024, on the 75th anniversary of the airlift, a formation of U.S., British, and German aircraft flew once more over the city. Among them was a restored C-54 named Spirit of Freedom. As it banked over the airlift memorial, it dropped hundreds of white handkerchief parachutes, each carrying a small chocolate bar and a note, to the children of tomorrow. On the ground, Gail Halvorsen's grandchildren watched and waved. The old pilot had passed away 2 years earlier, at age 101, but his story remained woven into the city's soul. Berliners looked up as the parachutes floated down, their shadows drifting across the grass. For a moment, it was 1948 again. And then the breeze carried them forward into the same open sky that had once saved a city and taught the world what freedom could look like. Epilogue: The Sky and the Stone. From airfields to cyberspace, from rubble to republic, Berlin's story continues to shape the conscience of nations. It tells us that power alone cannot sustain peace. Only trust, rebuilt day by day, can. It reminds us that the walls we build, political, digital, or personal, are never permanent. And it proves that sometimes the greatest acts of war are those fought without weapons. A plane that lands with food instead of bombs, a word that breaks a wall without breaking a city, a people who choose rebuilding over revenge. The city that once starved beneath gray skies now glows with glass and light. And somewhere above it all, the echo of propellers still turns, steady, patient, eternal, reminding the world that hope, once airborne, never lands.